All right. Hello, Anatomy and Physiology 12. Welcome to the circulation unit. In this first video, we are going to go over heart structure and function because we heart biology. You've got this heart sitting in your chest. I looked up some stats here just moments ago. The normal resting heart rate for most individuals is between 60 and 100 beats per minute. So I want to show you guys something kind of cool. Actually, let me exit this. Let's pull up a calculator. Check this out. So let's call it 80 beats per minute. You've got this heart, right, sitting in the middle of your chest. It's actually not really on the left-hand side. It's tilted and it points a little to the left. But it's pretty much smack dab in the middle. It's this muscle, and it beats a lot. So 80 times per minute on average. So 80 beats per minute times 60 minutes in an hour times 24 hours in a day times 365 days in a year times, let's say you're turning 17 this year. You're looking somewhere at that many, this is ballpark, right? That many heartbeats by your age. What is that? 700 and basically 715 million heartbeats by the time you're 17. That is mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. By the time you're my age, you're going to be over 1 billion heartbeats, which to me, that's so cool. So cool. This is why I love teaching biology. You've got this muscle sitting in the middle of your chest that's keeping you alive, circulating blood so that you can have gas exchange, right? It's all related. And that sucker in my body has beat more than 1 billion times. Maybe I should say 1 billion. And I'm putting my pinky finger in my mouth when I say that. Man, I'm a dork. But here we go. Heart structure and function. Super cool stuff. I'm getting excited. I'm nerding out already. Sorry. So, the heart in a human being, 4 chambers. There are 2 smaller, less muscular chambers up on the top called atria. So that's plural. There's the right atrium and the left atrium. And we're going to see that the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the heart have very different jobs. The right-hand side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood from your body and then pumps it out to your lungs to become oxygenated. The left-hand side then receives that oxygenated blood and gives it a big push out to the rest of your body. So those 2 top chambers, which are right here, are the atria. Their job is just to squeeze the blood into the ventricles. So you can see the atria are smaller, and notice the walls are thin. There's not as much musculature in those walls. So they contract. They push blood through some valves into these larger chambers called ventricles. There's the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Those you can see, look at how muscular they are. They give a big squeeze on this side. That blood then goes out to your lungs to get oxygenated. And then on this side, it goes out your aorta and it feeds your entire body. Up to your head here, and then down and behind the heart, feeding your torso and your legs, the lower extremities. So the atria, smaller pushes, they receive blood, and then the ventricles give the big push either to your lungs or to your body. One thing you may notice as I'm pointing at this picture is when you look at pictures of the heart, notice the right ventricle and right atrium, right chambers, are actually on the left side of the picture, and vice versa for the left side. You always have to imagine that the heart is in your chest. So when you look at a picture of the heart and it's spun around the other way, the sides are going to be reversed. So do note that you have to imagine the heart is like in your body. That's how we differentiate between the left side and the right side. So if you're looking at somebody, then their left and right is opposite yours. So just a little mental note, anytime you look at a picture, the left side of a picture is actually going to be the right side of the heart. Heart tissue There are 3 layers we need to know about the sort of tissues, the cells that make up the heart. The outer layer, the outermost layer, is called the pericardium. It is a double layer membrane with a little space in between, and there's a lubricating liquid there to help reduce friction. And I've got a little note that says, where have we seen this before? Well, that's going to be just like your lungs, right? We said that you've got that sort of membrane covering the inside of your rib cage, the membrane covering your lungs. There's a space in between that fills up with a bit of fluid, and that helps reduce friction so that when you're breathing, respiring, you're not burning any holes in anything with friction. It's exactly the same for your heart. If it's going to beat billions of times, literally billions of times in your lifetime, you can't have friction wearing things out. So we've got the pericardium, which is producing that lubricating liquid. Now and protecting from friction, both the heart and the surrounding chamber that it sits in, or area that it sits in your chest. There are some other functions to the pericardium. The big one is to reduce friction, but it also limits heart movement. So if you're like jostled or something like that, if you're a hockey player, you get hit into the boards, it sort of holds it in the center and keeps it from bouncing around too much. That's really, really important so we don't break any little blood vessels going to or from the heart. The lubrication I already had mentioned. And then it's also infection protection. Nice little rhyme there. The heart muscle is incredibly important, and we really don't want any viruses or bacteria causing any issues or inflammation of that heart tissue. So you've kind of got it sealed off by the pericardium, keeps it protected, and it does keep, it's not perfect, but it does keep that tissue from being infected by viruses and bacteria much more often than other parts of your body. So it's an important piece, so we keep it enclosed in the pericardium, which helps limit infection. Now, the middle layer is the myocardium. So anything to do about heart, you'll see like cardium, cardiac. Maybe you've heard of cardiac arrest. That's a heart attack when your heart stops beating. The middle layer is myo. Myo means muscle. So this is cardiac muscle tissue, and it's striated. It's actually sort of looks like it's got little lines in there. You can see in this picture there's lots of mitochondria, which I don't think should be a surprise because we've got lots of heart beating. This thing contracts 80 times a minute on average for people. You need energy, ATP, for that to happen. So there's going to be lots of mitochondria in your heart muscle, aka the myocardium. And then you've got the inner layer of your heart, which is the endo. Endo means inside. The endocardium. And it's just connective tissue and kind of specialized skin tissue. Endothelial tissue, you can almost imagine it would be like the inside of your mouth. Probably a little bit shiny like that. And it helps control the myocardium. So that activity, how sort of quickly your heart is beating, is sometimes controlled a little bit by the inner layer, the endocardium. Although most myocardium activity, most of your heartbeat has less to do with the endocardium. The endocardium is going to be protective to have blood flow through your heart without damaging it as well. There's some friction reduction there with that endocardium. But most of your heartbeat is actually controlled by nerve impulses, which is probably no surprise. And we will see that in the very next video. What controls the heart? There's a part of your brain and there's some other triggers that can speed up and slow things down. There you go. So there's the big job for your endocardium. So I'm going to say, hey, that's the one you want right there. And the myocardium, it's the muscle layer, the one that's actually causing contractions, which is keeping you alive 80 times per minute, more than once per second for most people. I should mention, though, that for some people, heartbeats can be higher. A lot of it's genetically controlled. For myself, and usually people who are athletic and are in, we would say, good shape, good athletic shape, my resting heart rate is in the low 40s. So it's actually quite low, and that's because I run a lot. So it, at rest, slows down a whole bunch. It's not really a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. What it does mean, though, sometimes is when I stand up, because it's not really moving blood through my body that quickly, compared to somebody who's got double the heart rate at 80 beats per minute, is because my blood is moving a bit slower. That brings my blood pressure down as well. And sometimes when I stand up, actually often when I stand up, I get pretty darn dizzy. And maybe you guys have those episodes too. A low heart rate can be... I've never actually passed out from that, thankfully, but sometimes I do actually have to like lean against things because I feel like I'm going to go out or lose consciousness, which is kind of crazy. It's taken a second for blood to get to my brain. It's actually starving my brain of oxygen, which is maybe not a good thing, but there's no long-term negative health impact, thankfully. So there's your layers of heart tissue. Just randomly here, endocarditis. That is when you do get a bacterial infection. It's usually bacterial anyways, of the endocardium. So somehow something sneaks in through the pericardium, that outside layer that is usually infection protection. And it just mentions a few things here. You could pause the video and look. Some weird things though, like look at your toes. I find this one weird. You get these like spots on your toes. You get fever, heart failure. That's obviously really bad. Stroke is really bad. But like you get these little spots on your fingernails. Your toes start to go purple and mottled. Same with your this rash down on your legs and your feet. So it's kind of weird. Most people are not going to suffer from endocarditis. So don't worry about it. And if you did get sick, you'd end up going to the doctor and they would diagnose it anyway and treat you with antibiotics if it's bacterial. But kind of an interesting infection that most of us will not have to deal with, thankfully. The septum is this wall here in the middle of the heart that separates the two sides. It's really, really important to have that separation between the two sides of the heart. Why is it so important? Whoops, I didn't even answer that. Some of you might know. It's really, really important because the right-hand side of the heart is deoxygenated blood. So the right side is all deoxy blood. And the left-hand side is now the blood that's come from the lungs. It's oxygenated blood. So I'm going to shorten it to oxy blood. And the septum is really, really important because it prevents that blood from mixing. We want to have the one side just deoxygenated blood so we can send it up to the lungs. And when it comes back to that left-hand side, we want it to stay oxygenated. We don't want to mix it up with any of the deoxygenated stuff, because when your left ventricle squeezes and pushes all that blood out to your body, you only want your body receiving oxygenated blood. Because that's the whole point, right? Is to deliver that oxygen with the hemoglobin, like we saw last unit, to deliver that for cellular respiration. So it prevents mixing of the deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, which is really, really important to maximize the efficiency of our circulatory system, of our body. Now, there may be some of you watching this, and this is a really neat discussion, because usually this is something that's happened to one or two of you in the class. But sometimes people can have what's called holes in their heart. And I've got a whole bunch of writing here. You don't need to know all of this or the terms. But a hole in the heart is called if it's up between the atria, then it's called an atrial septal defect, an ASD, and that allows blood to mix between the atria. We don't really want that. You can actually also have a hole in the septum between the two lower chambers. That's called a ventricular septal defect. And you don't really want mixing between the blood there either. You don't want it in either spot. Both of them cause some deoxygenated blood to go out to the body, which is not what we want. It decreases the efficiency, like I mentioned. Now, what's interesting is when we all developed in our mother's uterus, there was, on purpose, a hole in our septum because the baby's heart isn't beating. So it actually sort of bypasses and goes straight from the right side to the left side and out to the body. That hole's supposed to be there. And then once you're born, it's actually the very first breath, which is interesting, is a trigger for your body to start fixing that hole and actually filling it in. It takes a while. But in some people, that hole in their septum takes a little bit longer to fill in, or it actually doesn't close up on its own. The body just doesn't close it, and it requires surgery. And quite often, students in class, somebody will put up their hand and go, yeah, I had a hole in my heart. I had one of those that took a little bit longer. So quite often, it will seal itself on its own. It just takes a bit longer. So doctors will sort of watch it and make sure. And then I've had a few students, actually, who needed like surgical intervention, where they watched it, that ASD or VSD, the hole in the septum, wasn't sort of closing properly, and so they went in and closed it with surgery. If it is something that isn't caught for a long, long time, then that inefficiency in delivering oxygenated blood to your body can actually have some lasting impacts. Like one fellow, a kid down the road from me, had a hole in his heart. And they didn't actually know for a while. They didn't catch it, and they didn't actually seal it up for several years. And he's like way smaller now than a normal individual. His growth was slowed down because of this inefficiency in delivering oxygenated blood to his body. It just didn't develop at quite the right rate. And by the time they fixed it, he was behind in his development and his body never caught up. So he's totally fine and totally healthy, but he's a little guy. His dad's a big guy, and he's little. And they guess it's from that hole that he had in his heart that they didn't catch for a while. Here are the symptoms, things that a doctor might look for. When you have one of those holes in your septum, whether it's between the atria or the ventricles. There you go. So that fellow I talked about, his name was Aaron. Great guy. He had poor growth, and he just never really caught up, but totally fine now. Just smaller, that's all. So this one's showing you right here. If you got a hole in the septum, there can be blood mixing. That's inefficient, right? Not what we're looking for. Okay, heart valves. Blood flow through the heart. It's all one-way streets. You never want to have things like backtracking or blood going backwards. So to help that happen, heart valves prevent backflow. So they keep blood flowing in only one direction. There are two of them between the atria and the ventricles. So that would be this one here and this one here. So when those atria contract and they squeeze blood into the ventricles, there are valves that open, and then those valves are going to snap shut and prevent blood from going back into the atria. We never want to go backwards, one-way streets. Those are called atrioventricular valves, or for short, AV valves. And they're called that, generally. They do actually each have specific names we'll need to know. But they're called AV valves because they separate the atria from the ventricles. Pretty self-explanatory. They have some little supporting cords called chordae tendineae that help prevent those valves from inverting. Because it turns out when your ventricles contract against those closed valves, there's a lot of pressure, a huge amount of pressure. And without some little sort of like supporting rope-like structures, they could potentially actually just open up backwards, and then blood would go back this way into the atria, which would be really, really bad. Right? That's not what we want. That would be incredibly inefficient. So in order to keep things moving in one direction, you can see the chordae tendineae are these white structures here. And they are going to help anchor those AV valves to prevent any backflow. Here's a real-life picture of them. Found it on Wikipedia, just so you can see what this looks like. There they are. So I don't know if that's on the we'll see these terms in a moment, the tricuspid or the bicuspid valve. But here's the valve itself, and then these are all these little supporting structures that help keep that valve, just when it's closed, it helps keep it nice and tight. And it actually physically prevents the valve from opening up the other way. So the valve can only open in one direction, and then as soon as it's closed, those chordae tendineae are now taut, and it prevents it from popping open the other way. So that's pretty cool. Here's what you need to know. On the right-hand side, the valve is called the tricuspid valve. And this diagram shows it nicely. On the left side, tricuspid. Tri means three, cuspid is flaps. So this is a valve that's made out of 3 flaps. And then over on that left-hand side, it's the bicuspid valve. 2 flaps only. Some people also call it the mitral valve. I don't really care which name you go with as long as you know one of them. So the right-hand side is a tricuspid valve. The left-hand side is the bicuspid valve. And the tricuspid valve would look like this. They're kind of circular. And it would be 3 flaps, kind of like that. All right, 1, 2, 3 flaps. And then your bicuspid valve has only 2 flaps, so it is pretty much cut right down the middle, where you've got 1 flap and then 2 flaps. So that was the AV valves. There are also some valves here and here between the ventricles and some blood vessels. Those are called semilunar valves because they actually resemble the shape of half moons. You do need to know these ones, but they're actually pretty easy names, to be honest. The pulmonary semilunar valve is between the right ventricle and something called your pulmonary trunk. It's the one that prevents backflow when you squeeze to your lungs. And lungs is pulmonary. Hopefully you remember that from last chapter. So that's on the right-hand side. When we squeeze to the lungs, right here, the blood is going to go past the pulmonary semilunar valve because we're going to the lungs. And on the other side, that deoxygenated blood, when the ventricle squeezes, it's going to force the blood through here into the aorta. So that's called the aortic semilunar valve. So that's between the left ventricle and the aorta. So once the left ventricle has squeezed that blood into the aorta, that valve will snap shut, and it prevents the blood from leaking back into the ventricles. Because you can imagine, for both of these semilunar valves, gravity wants to pull that blood back into the ventricles, and we don't want that to happen. One-way streets. So those semilunar valves are going to help prevent that. These heart valves, because the pressure is way less when it's just gravity pulling back down, they don't have chordae tendineae. It's just your big valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, that have the chordae tendineae. These ones do not. So here's a diagram showing all the different structures in the heart that you need to know, and the direction of blood flow through the heart, which you need to know. And we're going to go through that, and then we'll label a diagram together at the end. So here we go, blood flow through the heart. Deoxygenated blood from your body. So your body's used up the oxygen in the blood. It's full of now CO2. That deoxygenated blood is delivered back to your heart through 2 big blood vessels called the vena cava. And the one that drains the top half of your body is called the superior vena cava. And the one that drains the bottom half of your body is called the inferior vena cava. So those carry oxygen depleted, oxygen poor blood into the right atrium. Then the right atrium is going to pump that blood. It's that top thin walled chamber. It's going to squeeze the blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to give a nice big muscular squeeze because it's got much more muscular walls than the atrium did. And it's going to squeeze through the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then the blood is going to travel through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. At the lungs, that blood becomes deoxygenated. So I'll just put that in brackets. So the blood becomes oxygenated. We looked at last chapter how all of that happens. And now pulmonary veins carry that oxygenated or O2 rich blood back to the left side now, to the left atrium, the top chamber. The left atrium is going to squeeze and push that blood through the bicuspid, the two-flap valve, into the left ventricle. The left ventricle, it's the one that gives the biggest push of all. It's the most muscular chamber of the heart. It gives a huge squeeze, pushes blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. That's the big blood vessel that comes off the top of your heart. Oh, let me go back. And from the aorta, that is the blood that then goes to your body. So that carries blood to the body. So we're going to go through this in a separate video because this one's getting a little bit long. So I'll quickly show you some neat little pictures, and then I'll make a second video that you should watch that goes with this one, where one of the documents that is sitting on the website, it's a heart diagram. We will label all of the chambers, and then with some arrows, talk about the path of blood through the heart, because to see this sort of happen is a lot nicer than just listing it in point form. So that's a little bit confusing. Don't sweat it. Once we go through the diagram together, you'll be good. Hey, look at that. I Heart Science with an anatomical heart. Love that picture. And here's a cartoon I thought was kind of funny. This is becoming an adult. You guys know this, right? Adult responsibilities. Your brain tells you to do one thing, and your heart just whatever it desires, right? Chasing the utter nonsense, the things like butterflies that just make you feel good, right? The brain versus the heart. So, you can stop this video, give your hand a little stretch, and then grab yourself that heart diagram and watch the very next video, because we will label all of that pathway through the heart in a nice short secondary video. So stop this one, start the next one. I'll see you very soon.